You're listening to the 95 Podcast from the team at 95 Network, where we host conversations specifically designed to support leaders in small and mid-sized churches.
Well, hey everyone, welcome back to the 95 Podcast. I'm Dale Sellers, Executive Director of 95 Network. And I've got a very special guest with me today. Ben Struss is with me. He's actually in Chicago now, but that's not where he lives. And he'll tell you all about that in a minute. Ben, welcome to the 95 Podcast.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you.
I met Ben, and he had to think I was a strange person, which most people do. But I attended a service at First Assembly of God in Greenville, South Carolina. And Ben spoke that morning and shared about what he and his family are doing in ministry. And I just got so inspired by his story, by what they're doing. So I just kind of cornered him in the foyer of the church and said, "Hey man, I do this thing and I have a podcast." And I know you must have thought, who is this weirdo? But I just felt like your story would be very helpful to our audience today because it's filled with small and mid-sized church leaders. And I was inspired by the stuff you shared. And so I just want to kind of walk through that. So take as long as you need, but just kind of tell me your story, tell us who you are, and then we'll kind of get to what you're doing and go from there.
Sure. Well, my name is Ben Struss, and my wife, Kathleen, and we have two boys, Caleb and Levi. They're 9 and 6, and we are missionaries in the country of Indonesia. And we've been serving there for nearly 10 years. And so we got started, my wife and I both, when we were still students, when we were teenagers. And so I got my call to missions when I was 12 years old. I went to a big event called Acquire the Fire. Those have been around long enough maybe remember Acquire the Fire.
I used to take our young people to them, so I remember.
Yeah. So I went to an Acquire the Fire event, and that's where I gave my life to the Lord. And it was at that same event that they had an opportunity to sign up for mission trips that were happening that summer. And so I remember standing to my feet and making a commitment that summer I wanted to go on a mission trip. And I thought there's no way that my parents would ever let me, as 12 years old, go to Mexico on a mission trip. And so I went home and I told them all that God had done in my life. And to my surprise, they gave me the green light. And within about 6 weeks, I was on a plane heading to Dallas, Texas, training with a group of 11, 12, and 13-year-olds to go to Juarez, Mexico. And so it was on that trip. I know that's crazy to go to Juarez, Mexico now, but back then it was still a little bit.
Gotten saved, correct?
Yeah. It was a little bit safer back then.
Yeah.
But anyway, so we, on that trip, it was the first time sharing my faith and, seeing poverty and seeing anything outside of my context of the United States. I grew up in Pennsylvania, and so that was basically my world. And so this was my first time outside of that. And it was on that trip that they used as an opportunity to share about the need for missions and missionaries. And I think during that time, the big missions thing was the 1040 window.
It was
the area between, was it like 10 and 40 degrees longitude and latitude, and being the most unreached area of the world. And so that really just captured my heart. And I'll never forget, on that trip, I was having my devotional time. They had us have an hour, time with the Lord every single day. And somehow I ended up in the book of Isaiah, chapter 40, verse 3. Mm-hmm. And it says, "I'm but a voice calling in the wilderness, preparing a way for the Lord, making straight a highway for my God." And I'll never forget in that moment feeling the Holy Spirit speak to me that I was going to be his voice to the nations. And so that just got in my heart at 12 years old. And almost every summer I went on a mission trip and was following that call. And whenever I graduated from high school, I actually did an internship with Team Mania Ministries, that same organization, for a year. And then ended up at Bible school in Chicago at Moody Bible Institute. And so I did 4 years there studying to become a missionary, intercultural ministry, met my wife. And when we were preparing to graduate, we had just gotten married, and we were just asking the Lord where he would have us serve. And we were really, like I said, I always had this burden that I wanted to be somewhere where the gospel has never been preached. And so for us, we began just praying about all of the different countries in Asia Pacific. And, and it was one of those things where it was just, as we began to learn more and more about Indonesia, God gave us a burden for that country. Indonesia is the fourth most populated nation in the world. A lot of people don't realize that.
I didn't know that till you. I'd heard you say
Yeah.
it at the church that day.
Yeah. So, I mean, number one is China, number two, India, number three, United States, but number four is Indonesia with about 270 million people there. And the other thing is it's the largest Muslim nation in the world. There's actually more Muslims in Indonesia than the entire Arabic speaking world combined. Wow. And so, so for us, it was like, how could we not go there? And we call, the area of the world we live in, the people there, the never reach, because they'll go their whole life and they'll never see a church. They'll never meet a Christian. They'll never hear about Jesus unless someone goes and tells them. And it's been that way since Jesus, came and ascended to heaven, that they've never, ever, ever have heard about Christ. And so I believe that that's, the final frontier of world missions. And what's unique about Indonesia is we have an opportunity to actually serve there as missionaries. I have a religious workers visa. So I pastor a church, and we planted a church there, which I can share more about, but that's a little bit of our backstory.
Ben, geographically, can you give us a mental picture of where Indonesia is? Because honestly, I thought Indonesia was part of China till I saw you. And I don't know if that's just me being dumb or if somehow I connected them. I don't know how I got that wrong. Kind of where's it located?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so Indonesia is an island nation, 17,000 islands that stretch basically from India all the way down to Australia. If you were to look at a map, it's kind of in the region of where Singapore, Malaysia, the bottom part of Thailand, the Philippines, like that sort of area of the world in Southeast Asia, closer to Australia. It kind of follows that ring of fire, if you've ever seen that on the map. Yeah.
There was a movie out that just came out with George Clooney and Julia Roberts, and they were in Bali. Is that there? Is Bali?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. See, because I always thought Bali was in India, but again, not knowing where these places are. And the thing about it is there's very few Christians in all of this, is well, from what I understand of what you said the day that I heard you speak.
Yeah. So the unique thing about Indonesia is they have 5 religions that make up the country. The majority is Islam, which is about 90%. And then after that, the second and third largest would be Catholicism and Christianity. They kind of separate those two. And then you also have Hinduism, which would be like on the island of Bali, and Buddhism. And so there are, in certain areas of Indonesia, there are large pockets of Christians, but it's very geographical, because you can imagine the island, right? The islands sort of keep people separate and segmented. And so, one island is almost completely Hindu, other islands are completely Catholic. Another island where we live is completely Muslim.
I'm just trying to fathom, how many thousand islands did you say?
17,000.
I thought you said that 17,000.
Yeah.
How in the world can that be one nation? I mean,
right.
There's all kind of issues with that. But so tell me a little bit of and I almost wished I'd asked her to join us. Tell us a little bit of the background of your wife's story, because you guys connected and she was like, oh yeah, let's go be missionaries to this place. What's her backstory?
Yeah. So actually pretty similar. When she was 13, she went on a mission trip to Mexico as well. And
Why the fire?
No, but it was with her church. She's from the Chicago suburbs, and so her church took trips to different places. So she went with them. And it was the same sort of thing, though. On that trip, she felt the Lord speak to her, actually from Isaiah as well. But like that verse, "Who will go for me? Send me, Lord, I'll go." And also caught that same calling. And every summer we go on a mission trip to mostly in Latin America. And so whenever we met at Moody Bible Institute, we connected over that similar passion for missions. And she always thought she would probably end up in Latin America. But then as we began praying, and of course my passion to go to the never reached, we ended up in Indonesia. But Yeah.
Tim, I always want to ask this question of a missionary, and I've never heard anyone ask this. How did your families, your parents and her parents, how did they react to the fact you're taking, and now you have, it's one thing for you two to pack up and go, but you got those grandbabies.
Yeah.
How did they react, or how do they feel about it all? I mean, and we can be as honest as you want to be.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the things that was probably helpful, we both come from Christian families. So my parents are strong believers, and then her mom is a strong believer. And so they, especially because we kind of got started pretty young, right? I was on a mission trip when I was 12, and then literally went every single summer. My wife did the same thing. And then I studied missions at Bible school. I think that my parents had, those before we went when I was 24 years old. So they had essentially 12 years to sort of accept that this calling wasn't going to just fade away.
Sure.
So I'm sure I never really asked them the question, how is this for you that we're missionaries and you only get to see, the grandkids this often or whatever? Because I don't necessarily want to know the answer to it, but
I appreciate that answer.
Yeah.
I like to ask real questions and you give a real answer.
Yeah. But I mean, I think that they're really proud as well. They're very
I'm
proud
sure.
of us.
Sure. They probably thought, though, you were going to go somewhere like, maybe Mexico or Canada.
Right.
They didn't think one of the worst places in the world. In Indonesia, especially on your island, are they hostile toward Christians?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. You do have events that take place that can be dangerous. For the most part, hostility comes in the way of finding a location for your church, building a building. Where we live, there's essentially no church buildings. All the churches rent, space in one little section of town. And it's the same section of town where there's also the brothels and everything else that the people don't want out in the open. And so that's where the churches are. So it's unique that way. That's there's certain areas, depending locally, how the community feels. There's a famous example in our city where a church was given permission to build the building. They began building it, and then the community halted the building project for, I think it was 20 years. And then it was about 3 years ago, there was, it would have been back in 2019, before the pandemic. There was these bombings. It was more ISIS related, and it happened in a couple of the cities on the east part of the island we live on. And so during that time, I mean, things get very heightened. I remember going to church, and the government's totally against that. So the government wants peace and unity, and it's a unique place, though. The religious climate during election cycles, everybody's trying to outdo each other, like who's the best Muslim, that sort of thing. But
one of the things in this world I can't comprehend. I try to understand it, but I just can't understand people hating people because of their beliefs. It's just like, I'm not hurting you if I'm a Christian. How does that hurt you? But it's like there's almost this antagonism toward, if you're not part of what we do, then you're, I want you dead almost. Do you see that kind of antagonism toward outsiders or other?
Yeah, I mean, I would say 90% of the time, no. 90% of the time, there's actually a belief in Indonesia where, for harmony and unity, and they because they have these 5 legal religions. So whenever I shared those 5 at the beginning, Islam, Christianity, Catholicism, Hinduism, Buddhism, you actually have that religion's actually on your identity card. And so everybody's religious. So you can ask the question.
So the state kind of sanctions it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can ask anybody, what's your religion? And they'll share one of those things. So a lot of the religious persecution comes, like I said, more locally where you're at, depending on the local leaders and the local government not allowing you permission to, build the church. So for instance, that example I gave of the church being halted for 20 years, that went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that they were allowed to have a church there. And so it was just a couple of years ago that the governor of our city actually had to go and, cut the red tape so that they could have their church.
Do they
So
have?
so it's a very unique place where, like, they say one thing, but then
Yeah.
locally the actual implementation. And there's places in Indonesia that are very Christian, little islands or cities. It's just the vast majority are not.
They're not churches, but are there mosques everywhere?
Oh yeah. Oh
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh yeah.
So
I mean, there's mosques everywhere. So yeah, where we live, I mean, yeah, you don't. It's easy to have a mosque. So
well,
there's
I live in Greenville, South Carolina, so we have a church on every corner, and then
sure.
there you have a mosque on every corner. But you would say, well, they
Yeah.
don't build churches; it's Christian churches that.
Yeah.
There are more Catholic churches there?
I mean, it's probably similar. I mean, there's just in general, there's not a ton of churches. Like in our city, we're a city of the greater area. We live in a city called Bogor, which is part of the urban sprawl of Jakarta. The whole area is like 35 million people, but our slice of the pie is about 2 million. And there's probably, you know, 50 churches in that, serving that 2 million people. So there are churches where we live. There's just not very many.
Wow, wow. Wh- when you think about being there now, what's kind of give us an idea of your vision or what you're hoping to accomplish? I mean, do you plan to live there till you die, or are you going to retire here? What's your kind of hope for the future?
That's a great question. Yeah. I mean, so one thing is I feel a very strong call towards church planting. We planted a church in 2019, November 3rd, 2019. So about 3 years ago. It was, right before the pandemic. Everything sort of happened with the pandemic in a similar timeline than it did in the United States. In March, we were shut down for about 10 months. And so, but when we planted that church, had great results in that, just really confirmed that passion for church planting, that if we can see the church established, we'll be able to change a city and a community. And so, so my vision for the future is to continue pastoring the church that we planted, but then to also see kind of a multiplying effect where we can train and equip Indonesian pastors to plant churches specifically in the urban environment around Indonesia. In terms of our long-term plans and vision, I mean, if you would have asked me 10 years ago, I probably would have said, well, we'll be in Indonesia for the rest of our life. But now, I feel like you work on like 10 years at a time. So I know like the next 10 years of our life that we'll be working, in establishing the church that we planted, and then as well to be able to start this church planting movement of training, equipping, mobilizing Indonesian pastors to plant churches in urban environments.
With that in mind, are you guys part of a denomination that's putting you there? And so you've got the support. How are you doing that?
Yeah, so we're part of the Assemblies of God World Mission. So we're credentialed ministers with the Assemblies of God, and we work alongside the Assemblies of God of Indonesia. They have their own, separate, however you want to call that, general council. Mm-hmm. In Indonesia, and so, but we work under the Assemblies of God World Mission.
Do they have school? Do you have like an AG school there? Because I'm thinking, okay, so here you are, you plant churches, you get it healthy. It sounds like you're very apostolic in that way. And then, once it's healthy, you have a vision to plant another church. How do you raise up the guys that's going to keep the one you got going, that you started going?
Sure. I mean, so yeah, the Assemblies of God has been in Indonesia for some time. And so we do have some great Bible schools, that, this Assemblies of God seminaries that have, bachelor's degrees and master's degrees and all of it. So, for us
in Indonesia.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. In Indonesia.
Okay.
So,
cool.
Yeah.
So you're training, I'm assuming you're training locals to take over.
That would be the hope. Our church is an international church, so the language that we use is English. My wife and I can both speak Indonesian, but we kind of are focusing on English-speaking Indonesians and then the English-speaking community in our city. Kind of going back to that vision that the Lord gave me when I was 12 to be a voice to the nation. So our church has 20 different nationalities that are represented in our church. We have a number of refugees that have gotten saved from Iraq and Iran, Afghanistan. Other parts of the world are also represented in our church, but about 80% are English-speaking Indonesians. They work in international business. They use English on a daily basis. Maybe they studied outside of the country, so they speak English. Their kids go to international schools, things like that.
What's the draw for people to come to Indonesia from all over the world? Because it sounds like they're doing that. Is it thriving? Is it economically doing well? Or what's the draw?
Yeah, I mean, there's different reasons. So a lot of our congregation is people in education. So the people they come to Indonesia to teach in international schools. If you go to the capital, of course, we have lots of embassies. So you got embassy workers there. Other parts of Indonesia, you have a lot of different mining companies and oil. And so depending on where you're at, you'll have, companies like Exxon and things like that are, have different things happening. There's not a ton of foreigners in Indonesia, but there are some for sure.
Well, probably not a lot of Americans, especially.
Yeah, not too many. Yeah, there's just not that much American business going on. So
that's pretty cool. Well, we're gonna take a short break, and we come back. I want to kind of dive into some of the family aspects of what it's like to be a missionary. So we're gonna take a short break. We'll be right back. Okay, back with Ben, just talking through being a missionary in Indonesia. And I really want to kind of talk about the family dynamic for a few minutes. And specifically, first of all, with you, how do you keep from being lonely?
It's a great question. Yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. I think, one of the hardest aspects, probably being in ministry in general, is the relationships, right? I think that I as I'm here in the U.S., I'm in the United States for 1 year, just traveling to different churches and people that support us. And so, I hear pastors all the time sharing about their struggles with loneliness and especially in the ministry, not feeling like they have people to talk to. And so, I feel like it's all that, but magnified even more as a missionary, because you're 12 time zones removed from, relationships in the United States. And so trying to make that happen. In the last several years, one of the things that I've had to do is be extremely intentional with the relationships that I do have, whether it be with other missionaries that are in Indonesia. Maybe, one of my closest friends is on a different island, but we try to talk every single week just to, hold each other accountable, sharpen each other, hear about how ministry is going, share struggles, share wins. And so that's been probably one of the most valuable things that I've done. And our family, trying to be really intentional with talking about our week and our rhythms and ministry, and trying to carve out time so that we can feel refreshed as a family, whether that's taking us, every few months, taking a small getaway just to try to escape the pressures of the culture and the ministry. I think one of the added things that we have on top of ministry is just the fact that when you're living as a missionary, especially in a place like Indonesia, it's like you never really, as soon as you walk out your front door, you're in the battle, whether that's just trying to, pay your electric bill, or, get something done at the store, or actually do something in ministry. And so it's really important to find those ways that renew you.
How are those things different than being in the U.S., the paying the bill or whatever? You're in the battle. What go deeper into that?
Yeah, it's all completely different. So it's a total learning curve too. I was probably one of the biggest surprises when we moved to Indonesia. We were young, but I felt like that my wife and I both had quite a bit of international experience. We had done, an internship for 2 months in Vietnam. We had traveled to many different countries. But I always say that's a very different, visiting a place, even if it's for an extended period of time, than to actually move there, right?
Yes.
And to have to figure it all out. And so figuring out simple things like, how do you get clean water, and where does your water come from, and how do you cook, and where's the cooking gas come from, and all of these things that you don't think about because maybe somebody takes care of it for you. So if you visit another country, even on a mission trip, you don't think about any of those things. How do you get around? Who rented the car? How do you, how does the driver get paid? All those things are just added cultural stress. But after 10 years, I feel like we figure it out. And then when we come back to the United States, we're kind of figuring it all out again. Like, wait a second, how do you get these things done here? I was 24 when we moved to Indonesia. So that's been the majority of my adult life. So.
Yeah. Does your wife feel safe there?
Yeah, I would say that she feels safe. She's obviously not here to answer that question, but I know that At times she definitely gets more attention than she prefers in Indonesia, both as a foreigner, not necessarily harassment, but just always everybody all the time giving attention.
When you say giving attention, what does that mean?
Dares, I at times for her as a woman will get, called by men, things like that. But fortunately it's never become, physical. It's just unwanted attention.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
talk about what it's like raising children as a missionary, and specifically as a missionary in Indonesia. And how old are your kids?
Yeah. So my kids are 9 and 6. My son, my 9-year-old, we brought him to Indonesia when he was 6 months old. And then my son, Levi, who's 6 years old, he was born in Singapore. And so we left Indonesia for 6 weeks just to have him. And then we came back. And so they've both grown up in Indonesia, and they have an extremely unique childhood. I don't think they realize, how unique their childhood is.
It's just normal to them.
So it's just normal to them, but they do love Indonesia. One of the, and then throw on top of all of that, 3 years of their life has obviously been during a pandemic, which has brought all sorts of unique challenges. So, probably the hardest thing for them is, relationships were constantly transitioning, and then a lot of their strong relationships, those people are transitioning. So that's one of the really hard things for them, that they build friendships with somebody maybe in our church or at the school that they go to. Maybe this person's is also a missionary kid or a foreigner or something, and then their parents, they're not planning to stay in Indonesia forever, so they move, and that's very hard for them. Probably most of the challenges are more for me and my wife, figuring out how to raise our kids in a foreign country. My kids, I think, enjoy the lifestyle that we have and the country that they live in. And so they're very proud to be missionary kids in Indonesia, and they're thankful to be in Indonesia. We made them over Christmas break, whenever they were spending some time complaining about something, we made them say 3 things that they were thankful for, and they both said, well, I'm thankful to live in Indonesia. And I just thought that was great, that they're actually grateful to have that life. But
I actually used to do that with my kids when I had 3 daughters, and if they ever got to fighting, I'd make them tell each other 3 things they liked about each other.
Right.
They'd always say, "Oh, I like her hair." So I get that. One of the things I was going to ask you this, and I'm assuming that are most people there brown skinned?
Yeah, Asian looking.
Yeah. And so you guys,
we definitely stick out.
Yeah, you're really white.
Yeah. Indonesians, the closest thing I could compare the way that they look anyway would be that people might have context for is like a Filipino.
Okay.
So, very similar. The island chain all sort of kind of connects. And so, very short, sweet people.
Just ask that question because, and I was thinking about what you said about your wife, but just, you guys would just stick out being walking down the street.
Yeah. My oldest son has red hair. So,
oh, wow.
And so he sticks out a lot. Whenever he was a baby, everybody wanted to hold him and take pictures of him. And so
now, I believe, if I remember, did you tell the story about what somebody wanted to hold him and took off with him?
Yeah.
Can you tell us that story?
Sure. Yeah. So
by the way, we'd been done. We've been done there. We've been going to the airport.
Yeah. So when we first moved to Indonesia, my son Caleb was 6 months old, and we were in language school for 1 year. And in the first couple months, we could barely speak the language. We were, learning how to say hi, how are you, what's your name, that sort of thing. And one of the things that really helped us was my son Caleb, because when we would go out, you can imagine it's a little bit intimidating trying to strike up conversations with strangers and practice the little bit of language that you have. But Caleb made it easier because everybody came up to us. They wanted to see the baby. They wanted to pinch his cheeks. They wanted to sometimes take pictures because he had this bright red hair, right? That nobody else looked like him.
Yeah.
And so on one afternoon when we were out practicing our Indonesian, we were talking to a neighbor, and this woman came out of nowhere, and she grabbed my son Caleb out of my wife's arms and started to hold him. Now, again, that became sort of normal. People would do that. And so we were continuing our conversation with this neighbor when all of a sudden, after about 2 minutes, we look around and we realize that Caleb is nowhere to be seen. We had no idea where he is. And we're trying to figure out, where did this woman take him? We didn't even know how to say, where did this woman take him in Indonesian? So we're using sign language, trying to figure it out. Well, they pointed down the street to a house about a block away. And so we walked down to that house, and there's this big tent that's erected out front, and there's some sort of party gathering going on. And sure enough, out of the house walks this Indonesian woman that now has my son Caleb strapped to her body with a cloth baby carrier. He's got a cookie in his hand, and he's as happy as can be. And my wife and I are terrified, right? Like, what on earth is happening? And so now we're invited into the party. And so I've got a plate of food in my hand. I'm now in this party, and we're trying to figure out, what sort of party is this? Is this a birthday, an anniversary? And it was like all the women in the party were playing this game of charades, trying to explain to us what this event was. And after a while, they started making a hand motion with scissors, and then they started pointing downward. And we realized that we were at our very first circumcision party for the 13-year-old boy that lived in the house. And so quite the experience.
We don't do those in Greenville, by the way. I just wanted to know.
Yeah. So the funny part about that is that family then became one of the primary people we would go to practice our Indonesian in that first year, because they were very welcoming, of course, and they loved playing with Caleb. But
do you know what the point was of her taking your son? What was
because
the reason?
So she wanted to bring him back to the party to show off this light-skinned boy with red hair to all of the guests. They just thought he was cute. And whenever, when you live in the village, it's kind of like the kids are all raised in the village. So it's not an inappropriate thing for them to do that. It just catches us off guard and makes us afraid, but it's like, the idea of it takes a village to raise a child is kind of very alive and well in Indonesia. So
when you think about your ministry there, what gives you great hope for the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. I believe that in Indonesia, we have an incredible opportunity to see Indonesia be the first Muslim majority country come to faith in Christ. And there's a few reasons for that. One is, I think, the proximity of Indonesia to, the hub of Islam, right? That Indonesia is, by proximity, the furthest away from Mecca, right? It's the furthest away from that stronghold of Islam. And so even the version of Islam that we get in Indonesia can be very different, and people are probably more open in Indonesia than they would be in other parts of the world. The second is that although it's a Muslim country, it's the largest Muslim population, it's actually a secular democracy. And so there's a lot of freedom of religion. It's legal to be a Christian, to have a church, albeit challenging, and at times, you might be ostracized from your family and all of that. At least legally, it's allowed. And so I think that is a huge deal. And then lastly, that we can actually be, I can be a missionary there. And so when you think about different countries in the world, even in Southeast Asia, I can't think of another Muslim majority country in the world where you can actually have the title pastor and be there and to plant a church and to have that sort of platform. And so with those sort of three things, it gives me a lot of hope that we will see a lot of fruit in Indonesia, and we're beginning to see that. I mean, we have story after story of how people have come to faith, and that the curiosity of the people in Indonesia towards Christianity and faith is really high. So it is a challenging place to live, but I feel like we're seeing, we're a part of something where we're seeing a lot of fruit.
When you're allowed to be called pastor, is that a respected title there?
Yeah, I would say so. Even among Muslims, for a lot of times it would be more respected.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
What's your biggest challenge you see going forward?
Yeah. Miss the challenge I think honestly in ministry in general that I've seen is just sticking with it, having the endurance to keep on going to the end. And of course, it hasn't been easy the last few years. But to me, that's the biggest challenge, that the challenge of what's that word that I'm looking for, but just longevity or whatever, not giving up. One of the scriptures that's really spoken to me is what is that? Is it in Galatians that the idea, maybe you can help me out if you can think of it, that the idea of not, if you don't quit, you win, right? Like if you keep on going long enough, don't become weary and doing good, but in due season you'll reap a harvest. Exactly. Thank you. And so just that idea of to continue doing the good work, to continue to keep on going, that if we keep doing it, I think you will see fruit, and it takes time, and it's hard not to quit, right? Sometimes it seems very appealing to quit and to give up.
Well, this is kind of, as we kind of move toward the end of the podcast, this is part of the motive I had of wanting you on, because I got to tell you my backstory a little bit. When I was in high school, I became a Christian at 7. So I was raised in church. Have no doubt that I became a Christian at 7. But God began to deal with me even early on, like when I was 12, like you, about calling me into ministry, and I wouldn't commit to it because I thought God was going to make me be a missionary somewhere I didn't want to go. So I wouldn't commit to full-time ministry. And I never will forget the day the Lord spoke to me and said, Dale, I don't want you to be a missionary. You'd be terrible at it. I haven't called you to that. I've called you to something different. And so we all have to find what our calling is and what our space is. But I admire so much of what you do. And honestly, you may not view it this way, but of what you give up to not be in America, to be there. I'm sure you'd probably say, yeah, but look at what we gain. But I wanted to have you on because pastors are quitting in groves right now. The pandemic didn't. I don't believe the pandemic will close any church. I believe the pandemic was an accelerator of a track that we were already on. And if you were already on the right track, you found a way to work through it. If you were on the wrong track, if you weren't trained, if you didn't know what to do, you really suffered. And so there's a lot of pastors who are dropping out now, who are hurting now, who are quitting now. And I wanted them to get some inspiration from you today, just because, and I'm so glad we can be honest on this podcast and say things like you just said, not giving up. How do you keep yourself not stirred up, but how do you keep yourself on track? Is I guess the best way to say it.
Yeah. I think one thing is constantly reminding myself of the mission, that calling, kind of going back to that. I shared that from at the very beginning, that mission, yes, that vision, whenever I was 12 years old. And so every single week, whenever I plan my week, I just do it on my notes on my computer. And at the very top, I put my mission statement that I'm a voice to the nations, and then the ways that I accomplish that. And so I'm constantly trying to remind myself of that, because it's easy to forget it. So that would be huge. I think the other thing would just be to continue building yourself in that courage. Like I feel like the church today and pastors and leaders just need like a fresh dose of that Holy Spirit empowerment and courage to stand up in the face of opposition and difficulty, and to not give up, to keep on going. I also realize I'm 34 years old, and so still have a long way to go.
Such a baby.
Well, it's true. I sometimes I know on podcasts, when I listen to podcasts and I hear somebody under 40 sharing, I'm kind of, half of my brain kind of tunes out. I'm like we'll see if they stick around till they're 70 and they're still in the ministry and make it all the way to the end. But those things, because we have struggled, especially after 10 years. The honeymoon has worn off, and the reality sets in, and the challenges with my kids' education and being away from family, and whenever whether it's babies are born here in the United States and we miss it, or somebody passes away, or there's life events take place, and that feeling, it didn't feel like sacrifice at 24, but whenever you're 34, you realize, oh man, my kids are missing out on things, and so they can kind of get to you. And I think it goes without saying, we all know that spending time soaking in the scripture is so important that, even this morning when I read the scripture, I'm just reminded that, those, I think I was reading about, like, those that, stick into the end, like they will be rewarded, that great is their reward in heaven. And I'm reminded of that our reward here, like we could try to store up treasures on the earth and we could have all sorts of experience and have all sorts of things, but it will all just fade away. It will end up being very foolish. And I have a feeling that if we just stick with it, right, even if we don't see much fruit here on the earth, during this time, during this season, I don't think we were ever even necessarily promised that in scripture, that we would all have a mega church or that it would be easy.
Learned that the hard way.
Yeah. And but that reality seems so distant, yet it's so real, right? That great is our reward in heaven, that we're storing up for ourselves something even greater than we could ever have here in the present. So
how much does mission clarity, vision clarity of what you've gone there to do, how much does that keep you on track?
It's very important. I think clarity of mission is incredibly important, that you have to have that clear vision and mission. This is what I'm doing. And I've got to constantly be reminding myself of it, especially in missions, because there's certainly times where we look at the fruit and we say, why are we doing this? Why are we putting our family through this? Why are we, seeing these challenges? And one of the things that I realized, we're in our organization, we are on the field for 4 years at a time, and then we're back for 1 year. And during this so we've been on the field for 4 years. We went through the pandemic, came back, we got back in June, and that first few months, it just took a lot of time to sort of decompress,
Sure.
The last 3 years. And one of the thoughts that I had is I wish that every pastor and leader could have even 30 days to sort of decompress and to reflect and to kind of recommit to that mission and sacrifice and what God has called them to do. Because I wonder if there'd be less people giving up and quitting if they could just have a moment to breathe.
Like
and I know that's not, and I don't know if that's necessarily possible for everyone. We're not really on sabbatical because we've been traveling the country, sharing our
Sure.
vision, but we've had enough space away from our typical ministry to get a fresh perspective and a fresh vision and, kind of get refueled.
I think the biggest missing ingredient in the local church in America, and I've been doing this for a while, and I actually did a sabbatical a couple of years ago and almost drowned. So it was not a great one. It didn't go well, but I think the biggest issue we have is we don't Sabbath. Pastors don't Sabbath. They preach about Sabbath. They talk about Sabbath, but they don't Sabbath. And so they need a sabbatical because they've gone through, 20 years without taking a day off during the week. And, and the Lord established Sabbath before the law. The Lord established Sabbath in creation. And it wasn't because he was tired. I think what happens is if you don't do that, you get to a place where you become very dependent on yourself. It's like God gave us tithing and Sabbath is a couple of things for us to look at and go, you can't do this without me. And so I did want to ask you this, in Indonesia, what do you do for fun? You personally, what do you do just to have a good time?
Yeah. I mean, I try to work out, every day, at least, 45 minutes a day, whether that's taking a leisure walk or run or lifting weights or whatever it is. I think that's really important. And then we do try to take that, that discipline of Sabbath and 1 day a week, shut things off. We read that book early on. There's a book about spiritual disciplines that was really popular. What's it called? If I remember it, I'll have to let you know. I'm sure that
I'll get you to send it to me in show notes and I'll put it in show notes. Okay.
Yeah, but it was very impactful. I know it's become very popular here in the United States this last year. I've heard so many pastors talking about reading it, but talk about just spiritual disciplines. It's very simple about taking a Sabbath and about specifically and really trying to disconnect. So that day we turn off our phones, we disconnect from everything because as everybody knows, when you're in ministry, it's constant. It's constant. It's just people are always texting you or emailing you or there's a need that comes up. And so trying to disconnect that way. And then I mean, one of the things we love is travel. And so, at least, a couple times a year, we're trying to travel and whether that's doing ministry and then on the back end, seeing something that really kind of rejuvenates. I mean, we're missionaries, so we want to have that sort of sense of adventure and that we're seeing the world and making an impact and seeing what God's doing in other places. So
I don't mean this to sound wrong, but I think a lot of times people they view, okay, well, if he's a missionary, we need to send him money. And I certainly think if there's any listeners we have now want to support you, I would love them to do that. But how could we support you as a friend? Because I guess my greatest concern for you and your wife is that you guys feel lonely, and I feel like today you've connected with a lot of our listeners. And if someone wanted to reach out to you on a friendship level, what can we do to just encourage you?
Yeah. Well, I think if any of the listeners, know a missionary or, they have a friend or somebody that their church supports, to remember a couple of things. Like one, I mean, reaching out to them is a huge deal. Nobody's doing that really. There's not people that are, it's typically the relationship between the local church and the missionary is missionary driven, right? It's a missionary sending newsletters and going and visiting, and there's that responsibility, and that the church sends the money, and so we are like sort of responsible for that communication. And I completely understand that. But if somebody had the desire, how can we actually be a blessing to a missionary?
Yes.
Then kind of flipping that. I also try to encourage churches at times, try to do for the one what you can't do for the many. I realize you can't do, if you're a church and you support whether it's 10 missionaries or 50 missionaries, you can't do something for everyone, but maybe one time a year you send, there's a missionary that maybe their family's struggling, or maybe you don't even know that. You just pray and God leads you to do it, but you send them some extra money so that they can take their family on a vacation or something like that.
Sure.
We've had churches do that, and it's always a huge blessing. And then, just occasionally pinging that missionary, sending them a message, an email, a note, letting them know that you pray for them. Whenever I send a newsletter, there's several churches that always respond and just say, hey, we're praying for that need. It could be somebody in the church. It's not even the pastor. And that's really encouraging, just to know that you are being seen and people are thinking about you.
Part of my motivation for this was to help people realize that you're a real person. You have a real marriage, you got real kids, and you've given your entire life to serve Jesus in another part of the world. I think often in churches we put money in the plate, and that's about as connected as we are to it. And that's why I asked that question the way I did. Obviously, I would love for people to help you financially, but I want to help you more than that. I'm hoping that through this podcast today, that people go, man, I want to be that dude's friend. I'm sitting there thinking, man, could I go play golf with him in Indonesia? And I'm going, I want to play golf. But just to know you're not alone, because we alluded to this earlier, but that when Promise Keepers came along, we discovered that 70% of all pastors said they don't have one close personal friend. That statistic is still true. It hasn't changed. I wrote a book called Stalled: Hope and Help for Pastors Who Thought They'd Be There by Now, because I felt totally alone. I felt like Jesus was keeping score and he was mad at me because I hadn't built a mega church. I understand all that. And I can't fathom the weight you would feel if you started feeling that, in another part of the world. So I'm hoping listeners right now, you'll connect, and I'll put all the connecting points, email, because the good thing about being a missionary today is that we have all this technology. We can do a Zoom call with you. I recorded a Zoom call with a dear friend, John Finkeldy. He is a pastor in Australia. Now, the fun part was he was on at 9:30 in the morning Thursday, and I was on at 9:30 in the evening Wednesday. So he told me, he said, don't worry, man, Thursday's looking great. So with technology, we can do all that. And so here's what I would love for you to do as we kind of wrap up the podcast. You're talking to hundreds of small church leaders, pastors, staffers, board members, people who have a volunteer, who have a passion for the small and mid-sized church. If you were sitting down with them over a cup of coffee right now, what's a word of encouragement or hope or advice or wisdom you'd share with anybody?
I mean, it's a couple things. I mean, the first thing to keep in mind that we shared earlier is just don't give up. I agree with Dale that, the backbone of the church in the United States and around the world is the small to mid-sized church. I'm at them every single week, and I believe that they serve a huge part in the kingdom. We're supported by over 100 churches around the country, and probably 80% of them are small to mid-sized churches. They're not mega churches. And so it is, those small to mid-sized churches are making a huge impact, with their missions giving, with their prayers. And I would also say to, that aspect of community, I know that in my life, for a long time, I was extremely isolated, especially as a missionary, not really having many relationships. And I know for myself, with my personality, just natural that way. I don't need that. I feel like I don't need that many relationships until my wife forced me to. She's like, you like, she forced me to go make a friend. Like, you need somebody to sharpen you and
You're in the
to hold
70%.
you accountable. Yeah. And I'm glad she did. And so having those, whether it's one or two, but realizing it's always interesting that everybody's lonely, right? Because if everybody's lonely, if they just start talking to each other, everyone would have a friend. Yeah. And so reaching out to those people and trying to start that intentional community, I believe it does multiple things, right? It helps with your personal spiritual life. It helps to help strengthen your local ministry with fresh ideas and vision and hope, and to get around other people. I mean, there's so much benefit to it. And then, of course, what you get to give to that other person. Yeah.
I have so enjoyed this, and I would love to catch up with you in a year or so, and maybe do a call with you on the field.
Sure.
Just to see how things are going. But I do want to say this, and again, I know some of our listeners, because I can sense it, you really want to connect with Ben and just on a friendship level and support them. We're going to have all the communication ways for you to communicate. We'll put that in the show notes so that you can connect with them. But I just want you to know I admire you. I admire you. I admire your wife. I appreciate what you're doing. I love your commitment to Christ and that calling, and that you're literally putting your life on the line. And I pray you get tremendous fruit from what you're doing, and that you don't have to wait till you get to heaven to find out all the people that you helped. I just pray you see some of that fruit now. And so if anything we can do at 95 Network to support you, to stand with you, please let us know. But man, thank you so much for taking the time to be on here today. This has been so good.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the 95 Podcast. We look forward to sharing another episode with you next week. In the meantime, visit our website at 95network.org. The website is loaded with great resources created for small and mid-sized church leaders. Until next time, have a great week.